The security guard at Ramstein Air Base had seen everything in 23 years of service. Drunk airmen trying to sneak back after curfew, protesters chaining themselves to fences, even a circus elephant that somehow wandered onto the tarmac in 1997. But the woman approaching Gate 7 on that cold October morning defied every category in his mental filing system. Her clothes hung in tatters, a threadbare peacoat that might have been military issue decades ago, boots held together with duct tape, and wild gray-streaked hair that caught the pre-dawn wind like smoke. She walked with a peculiar gait, not the shuffle of someone defeated, but the measured cadence of someone who had learned to conserve energy over long distances. Most homeless individuals approached with downcast eyes or desperate aggression. This woman moved with her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the base's imposing structures. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called out, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. "Standard protocol. Polite but firm. You'll need to turn around." The woman stopped exactly 10 feet from the checkpoint, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to avoid appearing threatening. When she looked at him, Rodriguez felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes weren't the clouded desperation of addiction or the darting paranoia of mental illness. They were clear, sharp, and held something that made him straighten unconsciously. "I need to speak with General Morrison," she said. Her voice carried the peculiar quality of someone accustomed to being heard over engine noise, radio static, and the chaos of operations rooms. "Tell him Valkyrie is here." Rodriguez blinked. Valkyrie. The name triggered something in his memory, fragments of stories whispered in mess halls, legends passed down through generations of airmen. But those were just stories, ghost tales about pilots who had vanished into history's shadows. He studied the woman's face again, noting the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting against wind and sun at 30,000 feet. "Ma'am, I'm going to need some identification and—" "Tell him," she interrupted, not rudely but with the quiet authority of someone who had once commanded squadrons through the hell of combat, "that Major Evangeline Valkyrie Thorne is requesting permission to come aboard one last time." The name hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Every Air Force pilot knew that call sign. Every aviation enthusiast had heard the whispers. Valkyrie, the woman who had disappeared after the classified operation that supposedly never happened. The ghost pilot of a dozen impossible missions. The legend who had vanished 20 years ago, leaving behind only questions and a Medal of Honor that sat in a locked drawer in the Pentagon. But legends didn't show up at security gates looking like they'd been sleeping under bridges. Rodriguez reached for his radio with trembling fingers, knowing that the next 30 seconds would either make him look like the biggest fool at Ramstein or witness him making the most important call of his career. The woman waited with infinite patience, her eyes fixed on the distant runway where F-22 Raptors sat in perfect formation, their sleek profiles catching the first light of dawn. Somewhere in those aircraft, in the precise angles of their wings and the deadly beauty of their design, lay the DNA of missions that history would never officially acknowledge. And standing before him, wrapped in the remnants of a life that had cost her everything, was the woman who had helped write the invisible chapters of American air power. The radio crackled to life as Rodriguez made the call that would shatter the careful silence that had protected both the military's secrets and one woman's sacrifice for 2 decades. Within minutes, the first general would arrive, then another, and another, each one carrying pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal why the most decorated female combat pilot in American history had been allowed to disappear into the margins of society, and why her return might mean the difference between victory and catastrophe in a war that hadn't yet been declared. But first, there would be silence. The kind of silence that falls when legends walk out of the mist and back into the light, carrying with them the weight of missions so classified that their very existence challenged the comfortable narratives of official history. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it, the promise that nothing at Ramstein Air Base would ever be quite the same again. General Morrison's coffee cup shattered against his office floor when Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled through the secure line. 20 years of commanding the largest overseas air base in the world had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared him for these 7 words. "Sir, Major Thorne is at the gate." He stood frozen behind his desk, watching steam rise from the spilled coffee like morning mist over a battlefield. The name echoed in his mind, pulling with it a cascade of memories he'd buried beneath decades of promotions, briefings, and the comfortable routine of peacetime command. Evangeline Thorne, Valkyrie. The pilot who had flown missions that officially never happened, who had earned commendations that could never be publicly acknowledged, who had disappeared into a black hole of classification levels so deep that even he, with his 4-star clearance, could only guess at their depths. "Repeat that, Sergeant," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Major Evangeline Thorne, sir. Call sign Valkyrie. She's requesting permission to come aboard. She looks like she's been living rough, sir." Morrison closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 25 again, a fresh captain watching a young woman with fierce green eyes and an impossible smile climb into the cockpit of an experimental aircraft that had killed its previous 2 test pilots. She'd given him a thumbs up through the canopy, her confidence so absolute that it had made him believe, for a moment, that the laws of physics were merely suggestions she could choose to ignore. That was before Bosnia, before the missions in Iraq that would never appear in any after-action report, before the night she'd walked into his temporary office in a forward operating base, handed him her wings, and said with quiet finality, "I'm done, Rick. Take care of yourself." He'd been Major Morrison then, not yet burdened with stars and the weight of an entire base. Young enough to think he understood honor and old enough to know he was watching something break in the woman who had redefined what it meant to be fearless. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice pulled him back to the present. "What are your orders?" Morrison reached for his secure phone, his fingers moving through the speed dial numbers that connected him to power centers across 3 continents. But he stopped. Some conversations couldn't happen over encrypted lines. Some truths were too dangerous to trust to any technology except the ancient protocol of looking another human being in the eyes. "Escort her to Conference Room Alpha," he said finally. "Full honors, Sergeant, and Rodriguez." "Yes, sir." "Nobody talks about this. Nobody breathes a word until I figure out what the hell is happening." Morrison moved to his window, which offered a commanding view of the flight line where 2 squadrons of F-35 Lightning IIs sat in perfect formation. Beyond them, the transport aircraft that formed the lifeline between America and its forward positions across Europe and the Middle East. All of it, the billions of dollars in hardware, the thousands of personnel, the intricate dance of global military logistics, suddenly felt fragile in the face of one woman's return from the void. He thought about the last time he'd seen her, not the official goodbye but the real one. 3 months after her resignation, he'd spotted her at a veterans' hospital in Denver, volunteering in the rehabilitation ward. She'd been helping a young Marine learn to walk again, her voice gentle but unyielding as she counted out his steps. When she'd seen Morrison, she'd nodded once, no words, just acknowledgement that they both carried secrets too heavy for casual conversation. That was 19 years, 7 months, and 12 days ago. He knew the exact count because he'd been tracking it unconsciously, marking time since the Air Force had lost its most capable pilot, and he'd lost the closest thing he'd ever had to a sister in arms. Now she was back, and Morrison knew with the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments that her return was no coincidence. Something was coming, something that required the specific skills of a woman who had once flown solo missions into hostile territory with nothing but her wits, her training, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. He grabbed his service cap and headed for the door, knowing that the next hour would either destroy his career or save more lives than he could count. Either way, he owed her the truth. All of it. The corridor outside his office stretched ahead like a runway, and with each step, Morrison felt the weight of 20 years of silence pressing against his chest. At the end of that hallway waited a ghost who had chosen to become human again, and with her, the possibility that some missions never really end. They just wait for the right moment to demand completion. Conference Room Alpha occupied the most secure section of Ramstein's command center, a windowless chamber wrapped in electromagnetic shielding that could defeat any known surveillance technology. Morrison had chosen it not for its security features, but for its isolation. Whatever conversation was about to unfold needed to happen away from the curious eyes and endless gossip networks that thrived on military bases. He arrived first, settling into a chair that faced the door and trying to reconcile his memories with the reports Rodriguez had given him. The Evangeline Thorn he remembered had been precision incarnate, every uniform crease perfect, every piece of equipment maintained to obsessive standards, every flight plan calculated to the nanosecond. The woman approaching his base supposedly looked like she'd been sleeping under bridges for months. The door opened, and Morrison's breath caught. She entered with the same measured pace he remembered, but everything else had been transformed by 20 years of living outside the military's protective embrace. Her hair, once regulation short and the color of polished copper, now fell in uneven waves streaked with premature gray. The peacoat she wore had indeed seen better days, but Morrison's trained eye caught details Rodriguez had missed. The faded outline where Air Force patches had once been sewn, the way she automatically scanned the room's corners and exit points, the unconscious positioning that kept her back to the wall and her eyes on potential threats. Most telling of all were her hands, scarred now, with calluses in places that spoke of manual labor and survival, but her fingers still moved with the precise economy of motion that had once danced across aircraft controls with surgical precision. "Hello, Rick," she said, and her voice carried the same quiet authority that had once turned turbulent squadron briefings into models of focused efficiency. Eva, the name felt strange on his lips after 2 decades of silence. Jesus Christ, where have you been? She lowered herself into the chair across from him with movements that favored her left side, an injury Morrison didn't remember from their shared past. Everywhere, nowhere, does it matter? It matters to me. Something flickered across her face, so brief Morrison almost missed it. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise that anyone still cared about the answer to that question. "I've been staying off the grid," she said finally. "Working construction in Colorado for a while, fishing boats in Alaska, disaster relief in Louisiana after Katrina, places where nobody asks too many questions if you can do the work." Morrison studied her face, noting the weathering that spoke of years under open sky and the subtle lines around her eyes that had deepened since their last meeting. But beneath the evidence of a hard life lived on society's margins, he could still see traces of the woman who had once been considered the finest combat pilot of her generation. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come back?" Evangeline leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since entering the room, she smiled. It was a ghost of the expression that had once lit up ready rooms and made hardened fighter jocks believe they were invincible, but it carried something new, a weight that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Because someone needs to tell you about the Blackbirds, Rick. And more importantly, someone needs to tell you what's going to happen when the Russians figure out we never actually grounded them." Morrison felt the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. The Blackbirds, SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft officially retired in 1998, supposedly mothballed in museums and storage facilities across the country. But Morrison had been in the Air Force long enough to know that officially and actually were often very different things. "Eva, whatever you think you know." "I know because I've been flying them, Rick. For 20 years in places that don't exist on any map, for people whose names don't appear in any organizational chart. And now the game is changing, and they need pilots who can handle what's coming. She reached into her peacoat and withdrew something that made Morrison's blood freeze, a set of flight wings, but not the standard Air Force design. These were black titanium, with modifications he'd never seen before and an inscription in a code he didn't recognize. "The question isn't where I've been," she continued, placing the wings on the table between them with the delicacy of someone handling a live explosive. "The question is whether you're ready to hear why I had to disappear in the first place, and why my coming back means we're about to find out if 20 years of preparation was enough." Morrison stared at the wings, understanding with crystalline clarity that the next words out of his mouth would determine whether he remained a general commanding a peaceful European airbase or became a participant in something that would redefine the nature of modern warfare. Outside the secured walls of Conference Room Alpha, the routine business of military life continued: maintenance crews servicing aircraft, pilots reviewing flight plans, administrators processing the endless paperwork that kept the war machine functioning. None of them knew that sitting in their midst was a woman who had spent 2 decades becoming something the Air Force had never officially acknowledged existed. And none of them knew that within the hour, that same woman would make a request that would force them all to confront the possibility that the Cold War had never really ended. It had just moved to altitudes where only the dead were supposed to fly. Morrison's hands trembled as he reached for the black wings, their weight far heavier than titanium should have been. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it retained heat from high-altitude flights through the thin air where the sky faded to black and the curve of the Earth became visible to the naked eye. "The Aurora Project," Evangeline said quietly, watching his face as recognition dawned. "You remember the rumors from the early 90s, triangular aircraft, sonic booms over the desert, reports that got buried so deep they might as well have been fictional." Morrison set the wings down carefully, his fingers still tingling from contact with metal that shouldn't exist. The Aurora Project had been whispered about in Pentagon corridors and aviation magazines, always dismissed as conspiracy theories or misidentified conventional aircraft. But he'd been briefed on enough black programs to know that the most persistent rumors usually contained grains of classified truth. "The SR-71s were retired publicly," she continued, "but the technology didn't disappear. It evolved. Aurora was the cover story for something much bigger, a program that took reconnaissance aircraft beyond the edge of space, into territories where the old rules of engagement didn't apply." She stood and moved to the room's blank wall, her hand tracing invisible patterns in the air, as if sketching technical diagrams from memory. "Imagine an aircraft that can reach Mach 8, Rick. That can climb to 200,000 feet and maintain that altitude for transcontinental flights. That can photograph every square inch of a country while remaining invisible to radar, surface-to-air missiles, and interceptor aircraft." Morrison felt his worldview reorganizing itself around this new information. "And you've been flying these things." "I've been flying the prototype. Call sign, Wraith. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's been gathering intelligence over places that would start World War III if anyone knew we'd been there." Her voice carried no pride, only the weary acknowledgement of someone who had carried an impossible burden for too long. "Why you?" Morrison asked. "Why did they need Evangeline Thorne to disappear for this?" For the first time since entering the room, her composure cracked slightly. She turned back to him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, the look of someone who had been alone with terrible knowledge for 20 years. "Because Wraith doesn't fly like anything else ever built. It requires a pilot who can handle 12 hours of solo flight at altitudes where one mistake means death, with no possibility of rescue, no communication with base, and no margin for error. The psychological testing alone eliminated 98% of qualified candidates." She returned to her chair, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its normal limits too many times, but mostly because they needed someone who was already dead. Morrison frowned. Dead. My official service record ends with a training accident in Nevada. Classified crash, pilot error, remains never recovered. That woman, the Evangeline Thorne who wore Air Force blue and flew with squadron patches, she died 21 years ago. What you're looking at is someone else entirely. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. 20 years of believing his friend had chosen civilian life over military service, when in reality she had chosen the deepest possible service. A commitment so complete it required the death of her former identity. The people I work for have no names, no faces, no official existence, she continued. They appear when the world teeters on the edge of catastrophe and disappear when the crisis passes. They've kept me flying missions that prevented 3 wars you never heard about and stopped 2 terrorist attacks that would have killed hundreds of thousands. Morrison's mind raced through the implications. But now you're here, blowing your cover, risking everything. Why? Evangeline leaned forward, her eyes intense with the focus he remembered from pre-mission briefings. Because something big is coming, Rick. Bigger than anything the Shadow programs were designed to handle. Russian hypersonic weapons, Chinese anti-satellite technology, North Korean submarine-launched ballistic missiles, all of it accelerating toward a convergence point that our intelligence models say will arrive within the next 18 months. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small device Morrison didn't recognize, matte black, roughly the size of a smartphone, with no visible controls or displays. This contains intelligence gathered during my last 5 missions. Information that can't be transmitted through normal channels because the enemy has penetrated our communications networks deeper than anyone wants to admit. What kind of information? The kind that will either prevent the next world war or ensure that when it starts, we're not fighting blind. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. But I can't deliver it to the people who need it most. My handlers have gone silent, Rick. Radio silence for 3 months. Either they're dead, or they've been compromised, or something has happened that's beyond their ability to manage. Morrison felt the walls of Conference Room Alpha pressing in around him. 20 years of commanding a peacetime airbase had not prepared him for the revelation that the world had been teetering on the edge of catastrophe, while he'd worried about budget allocations and training schedules. What do you need from me? Access to secure communications that bypass normal military channels. Authorization to brief key personnel who have been compartmentalized out of the loop. And most importantly, she paused, her eyes meeting his with the intensity of shared understanding. Someone I trust to help me figure out why the people who sent me on this mission have stopped answering when I call. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of 20 years of friendship, duty, and the kind of decision that transforms ordinary military officers into the stuff of legends that can never be officially acknowledged. Morrison looked at his hands, nodding for the first time the soft calluses that came from decades of desk work rather than cockpit controls. When had he become an administrator rather than a pilot? When had his greatest daily challenge become budget meetings instead of life-and-death decisions at 30,000 feet? Eva, I haven't flown operational missions in 8 years. My last time in a fighter cockpit was a publicity flight for some visiting congressman. You're talking about aircraft I've never seen, technology I can't even imagine, and mission parameters that sound like science fiction. She leaned forward, her eyes carrying the same intensity that had once convinced him to volunteer for experimental test programs that had killed better pilots than either of them. Rick, do you remember what you told me the first time I doubted whether I could handle a mission? Morrison smiled despite himself. I told you that the aircraft doesn't care about your doubts, it only cares about your skills. And what did I tell you when you thought you weren't good enough to make it through test pilot school? You said that being good enough was a luxury. Being necessary was all that mattered. Evangeline nodded. This is about necessity, not qualifications. The intelligence I'm carrying will prevent a war that would kill millions of people, but only if it reaches the right decision makers before the wrong people realize we've identified the security breach. That gives us a window measured in hours, not days. General Hayes's voice crackled through the secure line with the authority of someone who had made career-defining decisions in circumstances where perfect information was a luxury no one could afford. Morrison, I'm authorizing you to accept this mission under Special Access Program protocols. Your participation will be classified at levels that don't appear in any organizational chart. Are you prepared to accept those parameters? Morrison thought about his wife, currently visiting their daughter in California. He thought about his comfortable office, his predictable schedule, the 27 people under his command who depended on his steady leadership. Then he thought about the possibility that his refusal might doom the world to a conflict that could have been prevented by one night of courage. General, what happens to my command while I'm gone? Your deputy commander assumes temporary authority. Your absence is explained as emergency family leave. If the mission succeeds, you return to normal duties with a commendation that will never appear in your official record. If the mission fails, Hayes didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that failure would mean disappearing into the same shadowy realm that had claimed Evangeline 20 years earlier, their deaths explained by training accidents or administrative transfers that couldn't be verified. Rick, Evangeline said quietly, I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else, but this mission requires someone who understands both conventional military operations and the kind of improvisation that keeps you alive when everything goes wrong. More than that, it requires someone I trust absolutely. Morrison closed his eyes and saw himself 25 years earlier, standing in front of an experimental aircraft that represented the bleeding edge of human aviation technology. The same wild excitement he'd felt then was stirring in his chest now, mixed with the mature understanding of what such missions cost the people who flew them. When do we leave? Evangeline's smile lit up conference room Alpha like sunrise over a flight line. 1800 hours. There's a cargo flight leaving Ramstein for a classified destination in Nevada. We'll be listed as maintenance personnel inspecting equipment for potential transfer to European operations. Morrison felt his old instincts awakening. The mental checklist making, the automatic assessment of risks and contingencies, the comfortable weight of accepting responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be predicted or controlled. General Hayes, he said into the secure phone, I accept the mission parameters. Confirmed. Morrison, from this moment forward, you're operating under National Command Authority. Standard military regulations are suspended. Your mission priority overrides all other considerations, including the safety of personnel not directly involved in the operation. The line went dead, leaving Morrison and Evangeline alone in a room that suddenly felt like the eye of a hurricane. A moment of calm before forces beyond their control swept them into a chain of events that would either justify 20 years of sacrifice or transform them into casualties of a war most of the world would never know had been fought. Eva, there's something I need to know before we do this. She looked at him with the patience of someone who had learned to answer the questions that mattered while ignoring the ones that didn't. The aircraft you've been flying, is it survivable? I mean, if everything goes according to plan, do we have a reasonable expectation of coming back alive? Her laugh was softer than he remembered, carrying notes of experiences that had taught her to find humor in the darkest places. Rick, I've flown 847 missions in aircraft that weren't supposed to exist, over territory where capture would mean either execution or decades of imprisonment in facilities our government couldn't officially acknowledge. I've landed on runways that were nothing more than straight sections of desert highway, refueled from tankers that appeared on no flight manifest, and navigated by stars because GPS signals couldn't be trusted. She stood and moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. But I've never flown a mission where so much depended on success. The aircraft is survivable, the mission is feasible, and the intelligence we're carrying will prevent a war. But more than that, this is our chance to finish something that started when we were young enough to believe that courage and skill were sufficient to solve any problem. Morrison watched her leave, understanding that the next few hours would be his last as a conventional military officer. After tonight, he would either return to Ramstein as the same administrator he'd been that morning, or he would join Evangeline in the Shadow Realm, where heroes went to die anonymously for causes that history would never record. He reached for his phone to call his deputy commander, already composing the lie that would explain his sudden absence. But as his fingers touched the handset, Morrison realized that, for the first time in years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not behind a desk managing other people's courage, but preparing for a mission that would test everything he had learned about flying, fighting, and the kind of friendship that endures even when officially non-existent. Outside Conference Room Alpha, the routine business of military life continued, unaware that within hours, two of their own would disappear into the night sky on a mission that would determine whether tomorrow brought peace or the beginning of humanity's last war. The cargo bay of the C-130 Hercules transport aircraft resembled a mechanical cathedral, vast, echoing, filled with shadows that shifted with every slight movement of the aircraft through turbulent air over the Atlantic. Morrison had flown in military transports hundreds of times, but never as a passenger whose presence on the flight manifest was classified beyond the security clearance of the aircraft's crew. He sat on a canvas fold-down seat, watching Evangeline sleep with the profound stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy between moments of extreme stress. Even unconscious, she maintained the alertness that came from 20 years of missions where relaxing completely could mean death. Her breathing was steady, controlled, but Morrison noticed how her right hand remained positioned near the concealed weapon he was certain she carried. The aircraft's crew, pilot, co-pilot, loadmaster, and navigator, had been briefed only that they were transporting two maintenance specialists to inspect equipment at a classified facility in Nevada. The fiction was thin enough to be transparent, but military personnel learned early that curiosity about classified operations was a luxury that could end careers. Morrison tried to reconcile the sleeping woman across from him with his memories of Lieutenant Evangeline Thorne, fresh out of the Air Force Academy with test scores that had made seasoned instructors question whether the evaluation systems were sophisticated enough to measure her capabilities. That young woman had been brilliant, fearless, and absolutely convinced that technical precision could overcome any obstacle. The woman sleeping 3 feet away had been forged by experiences that had taught her the limits of both technology and human endurance. The precision remained, but it was now tempered by wisdom that came from surviving situations where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in milliseconds and decisions that couldn't be undone. The loadmaster approached with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that passengers on classified flights weren't interested in conversation. "Sir, we'll be beginning our descent in 30 minutes. The pilot asked me to inform you that weather at the destination is clear, winds minimal." Morrison nodded, noting how the young sergeant's eyes avoided looking directly at either passenger. Standard protocol for classified transport. See nothing, remember nothing, ask no questions that don't relate to flight safety. As the aircraft began its descent, Evangeline opened her eyes with the instant alertness of someone accustomed to waking up in potentially dangerous situations. She looked at Morrison, then at the cargo bay's small portholes, where the lights of Las Vegas were becoming visible through the darkness. "Home sweet home," she said quietly, her voice carrying only the slightest trace of irony. Morrison followed her gaze to the window, seeing beyond the city lights to the vast darkness of the Nevada desert, where some of America's most sensitive military technology had been developed and tested for decades. Somewhere in that desert was the aircraft that would carry them on a mission that had no backup plan, no abort procedures, and no guarantees beyond Evangeline's 20 years of experience with the impossible. "Eva, what exactly are we flying tonight?" She smiled with the expression of someone about to reveal a secret she'd been keeping for 2 decades. "Have you ever wondered what happened to all the research from the Aurora project? The official story was that it was canceled due to budget constraints and changing strategic priorities." Morrison had read the declassified reports, noting the careful language that suggested much more had been accomplished than could be publicly acknowledged. But the research continued. The research evolved. Aurora was designed for reconnaissance, high altitude, high speed, minimal radar signature. But the real breakthrough wasn't in the aircraft design. It was in the pilot interface technology. The C-130's engines changed pitch as the aircraft configured for landing, the familiar sounds of flaps extending and landing gear deploying. Through the portholes, Morrison could see the lights of what appeared to be a conventional airfield, but he knew that appearances in Nevada were often carefully constructed deceptions. "What kind of pilot interface?" Evangeline leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the aircraft noise that would defeat any conventional eavesdropping. "Neural link technology, Rick. Direct interface between the pilot's nervous system and the aircraft's control systems. No traditional cockpit controls, no instrument displays, no physical separation between human decision-making and machine response." Morrison felt his understanding of aviation technology undergo another fundamental reorganization. Neural interface systems had been theoretical possibilities discussed in military journals, but the idea that such technology had been developed and operational for 20 years was almost impossible to process. "You mean you fly by thinking?" "I fly by becoming the aircraft. Every system, every sensor, every weapon, it's all extensions of my consciousness while I'm connected to the interface. The aircraft responds to my intentions as directly as my arm responds to the decision to move." The C-130 touched down with the characteristic firmness of military transport landings, the aircraft's weight settling onto runway that stretched into desert darkness. As they taxied toward what appeared to be a conventional hangar complex, Morrison tried to imagine the implications of technology that erased the traditional boundaries between pilot and machine. "The learning curve must be incredible." Evangeline's expression grew somber. "The technology killed the first 6 pilots who attempted to use it. Neural feedback, sensory overload, complete psychological breakdown. The interface requires a specific kind of mind, someone who can maintain individual identity while simultaneously merging consciousness with artificial systems." Morrison understood why Evangeline had been selected for the program. Her combination of technical brilliance and psychological stability made her uniquely qualified for technology that would destroy most people who attempted to use it. The C-130's engines spooled down to idle as the aircraft came to a stop inside a hangar that was much larger than it had appeared from outside. Floodlights revealed a space that could easily accommodate aircraft much bigger than conventional military transports, with overhead crane systems and maintenance equipment that suggested capabilities far beyond routine aircraft servicing. "Rick," Evangeline said, as the cargo bay's rear door began opening, "there's one more thing you need to understand before we go any further." Morrison felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded revelations he wasn't prepared for. "What?" "The mission we're flying tonight. It's not just about delivering intelligence. The aircraft we're using has capabilities that will fundamentally change the nature of air combat. After tonight, everything you think you know about military aviation will be obsolete." As they gathered their minimal personal equipment, and prepared to leave the transport, Morrison realized that his transformation from administrator to operational pilot was only the beginning. He was about to be introduced to technology that represented decades of classified research, and then trusted to help deploy it in a mission where failure could trigger the global conflict they were trying to prevent. The hangar's air was desert dry and carried the metallic scents of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and ozone that suggested high-powered electronic systems. As they walked toward a group of personnel waiting near the hangar's far end, Morrison felt the weight of stepping across another threshold, from the world of conventional military operations into a realm where technology and human capability merged in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern warfare. Behind them, the C-130's crew was already preparing for departure, their mission complete once they had delivered their classified passengers to a facility that officially didn't exist. Ahead lay introductions to people whose names would never appear in any organizational chart, and aircraft whose capabilities would redefine what it meant to fly. Morrison's last coherent thought as they approached the waiting group was that, within hours, he would either understand why Evangeline had spent 20 years in the shadows, or he would join her in a realm where legends went to die quietly, their sacrifices measured only by the wars that never happened and the disasters that never occurred. The desert night stretched endlessly beyond the hangar doors, holding secrets that the morning light would never reveal. The personnel waiting in the hangar's shadow were unlike any military group Morrison had encountered in 30 years of service. No visible rank insignia, no unit patches, no identifying marks that would connect them to any official organization. They moved with the distinctive economy of motion that marked special operations personnel, but their equipment and demeanor suggested something beyond any conventional military unit. The apparent leader was a woman in her 50s, silver-haired and carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding resources that appeared on no official budget. She approached Evangeline with the familiarity of long professional association. "Valkyrie, welcome home. We weren't sure we'd see you again after the Moscow incident." Evangeline's expression tightened slightly. "Moscow was unavoidable, Catherine. The intelligence was time-critical, and waiting for safer extraction would have cost us the opportunity entirely." Morrison filed away this exchange, understanding that he was hearing references to operations that had shaped international relations without ever being publicly acknowledged. The woman called Catherine turned her attention to him with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating a piece of equipment for mission compatibility. "General Morrison, I'm Director Harrison. I understand Valkyrie has briefed you on the general parameters of tonight's mission." Morrison nodded, noting how Harrison's title carried no organizational context. Director of what remained deliberately undefined, another layer of operational security in a world where too much knowledge could be fatal. "I understand we're delivering intelligence that conventional channels can't be trusted to handle." Harrison's smile carried approval for his careful phrasing. "That's part of it, but tonight's mission serves multiple purposes, and some of them relate to capabilities that go beyond intelligence delivery." She gestured toward the hangar's far end, where floodlights were illuminating something that made Morrison's breath catch in his throat. The aircraft revealed in the lights was unlike anything he had ever seen, triangular in overall configuration, but with curves and angles that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle. Its surface appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the impression of an aircraft-shaped hole in reality. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "Actually, the project name is Seraph," Harrison said with the dry humor of someone who had spent decades managing impossible technologies. "Seraph 7 is the latest iteration of technology that began with Aurora, but evolved far beyond anything the original designers imagined." Evangeline was already walking toward the aircraft with the focused attention of someone conducting a pre-flight inspection from memory. Morrison followed, noting details that challenged his understanding of aerodynamic principles, control surfaces that seemed to flow seamlessly into the main structure, engine intakes that appeared and disappeared depending on viewing angle, and a canopy that provided perfect visibility while being virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the aircraft's surface. The neural interface technology Valkyrie mentioned is integrated into every system, Harrison continued as they approached the aircraft. But Seraph 7 represents a breakthrough that required us to fundamentally reconsider the relationship between pilot and machine. Morrison paused in his examination of the aircraft's landing gear, which appeared to be constructed from materials he couldn't identify to look at Harrison. What kind of breakthrough? Twin-pilot neural interface. For the first time, we can link two human nervous systems through the aircraft's control matrix, allowing unprecedented coordination and capability expansion. Evangeline looked back at them from where she was inspecting something near the aircraft's nose. What Catherine isn't telling you, Rick, is that twin-pilot interface has never been successfully tested in combat conditions. Tonight, we're the experiment. Morrison felt another piece of his comfort zone disappear. What are the risks? Harrison's expression grew more serious. Neural feedback between linked pilots can cause permanent psychological changes. In extreme cases, complete personality merger. Two individuals become something that isn't quite either of them. And the benefits? Processing speed that exceeds anything possible with single-pilot operations. Reaction times measured in fractions of seconds rather than seconds. And most importantly, the ability to simultaneously manage multiple mission profiles that would overwhelm any individual pilot. Morrison walked around the aircraft, noting how its proportions seemed designed for speeds and altitudes that pushed against the boundaries of atmospheric flight. The more he studied Seraph 7, the more he understood that conventional piloting experience would be minimally relevant to flying something that represented a fundamental evolution in human-machine interface. How long do we have to prepare for the mission? 36 hours, Evangeline replied, running her hand along the aircraft's surface with the intimacy of long familiarity. 12 hours for basic neural interface orientation, 12 hours for twin-pilot synchronization training, and 12 hours for mission-specific rehearsals. Morrison calculated the compressed timeline against the complexity of what he was being asked to learn. That seems inadequate for technology this advanced. Harrison nodded approvingly. Under normal circumstances, neural interface training requires 6 months minimum, but these aren't normal circumstances, and you're not a normal pilot. More importantly, Valkyrie has been developing training protocols specifically designed for accelerated interface adaptation. Evangeline joined them, her inspection apparently complete. Rick, remember when we used to joke about pilots who claimed they could feel what their aircraft was thinking? With neural interface technology, that becomes literal truth. The aircraft becomes an extension of your consciousness, and your consciousness becomes part of the aircraft's decision-making matrix. Morrison tried to imagine the psychological implications of merging his awareness with artificial systems capable of processing information at computer speeds. What happens to individual identity during interface? That depends on the pilot, Harrison said. Some individuals maintain complete psychological separation even during full interface. Others find that the boundary between self and machine becomes fluid, allowing unprecedented performance at the cost of conventional human identity. And twin-pilot interface. Evangeline's eyes met his with the intensity he remembered from their most dangerous missions together. Twin-pilot interface creates something unprecedented, a merged consciousness that includes two human identities plus the aircraft's artificial intelligence systems. For the duration of the interface, we become something that has never existed before. Morrison felt the weight of understanding that he was volunteering for an experiment that could fundamentally alter his consciousness in ways that couldn't be predicted or reversed. But as he looked at the aircraft that would carry them on a mission to prevent global war, he understood that conventional human limitations might be inadequate for the challenges they faced. "When do we start training?" Harrison smiled with the expression of someone who had successfully recruited another volunteer for humanity's most dangerous experiments. "Immediately. The neural interface preparation begins now, and from this moment forward, both of you are isolated from all outside communication until the mission is complete." As they walked toward a complex of buildings that appeared to be carved directly into the desert rock, Morrison realized that his old life as a conventional military officer had ended the moment he agreed to this mission. Whatever emerged from the next 36 hours would be fundamentally different from the man who had walked into Conference Room Alpha that morning. Behind them, Seraph 7 waited in the hangar, lights like a predator preparing to hunt, its surfaces reflecting the desert stars in patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond anything human engineering should have been able to create. The night sky stretched endlessly overhead, holding secrets that would either transform the world or consume everyone who tried to unlock them. The Neural Interface Training Facility existed 30 feet below the Nevada desert, accessed through elevators that descended past multiple security checkpoints into chambers carved from solid rock. Morrison followed Evangeline and Director Harrison through corridors lined with equipment he didn't recognize, the walls humming with the subtle vibration of powerful electronic systems. The preparation chamber resembled a medical facility crossed with a high-tech laboratory. Reclining chairs surrounded by monitoring equipment, holographic displays showing three-dimensional brain scans, and technicians moving with the careful precision of people working with technology that could kill as easily as it could enhance. The neural interface process begins with mapping your specific brain architecture, Harrison explained as Morrison settled into one of the chairs. Every pilot's neural patterns are unique, and the interface technology must be precisely calibrated to avoid psychological damage. Evangeline was already connected to monitoring equipment in the adjacent chair, sensors attached to her temples and base of her skull with the casual efficiency of routine procedure. Morrison watched her face relax into the meditative state he remembered from their early flying days. Absolute focus, combined with complete acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. "How many pilots have successfully completed this process?" Morrison asked as technicians began attaching sensors to his own head. "Counting Valkyrie, 17 pilots have achieved stable neural interface capability over the past 20 years, Harrison replied. Of those, 12 are still psychologically stable enough for operational missions. Morrison felt the familiar pre-mission calculations running through his mind: risk assessment, success probability, acceptable loss parameters. But the mathematics of neural interface technology operated in realms where conventional military analysis became meaningless. What happened to the other 5? Neural feedback syndrome. Their consciousness became so integrated with artificial systems that they lost the ability to function independently. They're alive, but no longer entirely human in any conventional sense. The lead technician, a young man whose movements suggested both medical training and extensive experience with classified technology, approached Morrison with equipment that resembled a sophisticated headset crossed with medical monitoring devices. "General Morrison, this is the basic interface crown. It creates direct neural connection between your brain's motor cortex and the aircraft's control systems. Initially, you'll experience disorientation as your nervous system adapts to processing information from artificial sensors." Morrison felt the crown settle over his head with surprising comfort, the contact points adjusting automatically to the unique contours of his skull. Immediately, his vision filled with overlays of information he couldn't yet interpret: streams of data, spatial relationship maps, and status indicators for systems that didn't correspond to anything in his aviation experience. "Jesus," he muttered, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "The disorientation passes," Evangeline said from the adjacent chair. "Try to relax and let your mind adapt to the new information streams. Fighting the interface only makes the adjustment process more difficult." Morrison tried to follow her advice, allowing his consciousness to expand into the artificial data streams flowing through the neural crown. Gradually, patterns began emerging from what had initially seemed like overwhelming chaos. The status indicators resolved into familiar concepts: altitude, airspeed, system health, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious analysis and fed directly into intuitive understanding. "Excellent adaptation rate," the technician observed, monitoring displays that tracked Morrison's neural responses in real time. "Most pilots require hours to achieve stable interface connectivity. You're processing artificial sensory input within minutes." Morrison found himself understanding the aircraft systems not through traditional instrument displays, but through direct awareness that felt like extension of his own body. He could sense fuel levels the way he sensed hunger, monitor engine performance the way he monitored his own heartbeat, and track atmospheric conditions the way he tracked changes in ambient temperature. "Now comes the challenging part," Harrison said. "Twin-pilot neural synchronization requires both individuals to maintain separate identity while sharing consciousness through the interface matrix." Evangeline's voice seemed to come from inside Morrison's mind rather than through his ears. "Rick, can you feel my presence in the interface?" Morrison concentrated, becoming aware of something that felt like a second layer of consciousness overlaid on his own. Not thoughts, exactly, but the distinctive pattern of Evangeline's decision-making processes, her unique approach to information analysis, her characteristic responses to stress and uncertainty. "I can feel you," he replied, his voice seeming to echo strangely in the shared neural space. "It's like having two sets of instincts operating simultaneously." "That's exactly what it is," she confirmed. "Now try to maintain your individual identity while accepting the merger. The key is understanding that you remain yourself even while becoming part of something larger." Morrison felt his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity, incorporating Evangeline's awareness while somehow remaining distinctly himself. The sensation was unlike anything in his experience, simultaneously intimate and impersonal, individual and collective, human, and something beyond human. "Remarkable," the lead technician murmured, studying displays that tracked their synchronized neural patterns. "Stable twin-pilot interface achieved in less than an hour. Most pairs require days of training to reach this level of integration." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Your shared combat experience provides an excellent foundation for neural synchronization. You already understand each other's decision-making patterns at an intuitive level." Morrison felt information flowing between his consciousness and Evangeline's with increasing efficiency. Mission parameters, aircraft capabilities, tactical scenarios, all of it processed simultaneously by both minds while being enhanced by artificial intelligence systems that operated at superhuman speed. "Now we test the full integration," Harrison announced. "You'll be connected to Seraph 7 systems while maintaining twin-pilot neural link. This is where we discover whether your minds can handle the complete merger with artificial intelligence." Morrison felt a moment of vertigo as additional data streams flooded into his consciousness. Not just aircraft systems now, but sensor arrays capable of processing electromagnetic spectrum data across frequencies he couldn't have imagined, navigation systems that operated by correlating stellar positions with quantum mechanical precision, and weapons targeting systems that could track multiple threats while calculating intercept solutions in real time. But instead of overwhelming him, The additional information felt like natural expansion of capability. Through his connection with Evangeline, he could sense her managing data streams that complemented his own, their combined consciousness creating something that was far more capable than either individual pilot could have been alone. "This is incredible," he said, his voice carrying wonder that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that human consciousness could expand far beyond its normal limitations. "This is just the beginning," Evangeline replied, her mental voice carrying satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "Wait until we're actually flying. The real capabilities of neural interface technology only become apparent when you're managing life-and-death decisions at Mach 6. Morrison felt their shared consciousness settling into comfortable synchronization, two distinct identities operating within a merged awareness that incorporated both human intuition and artificial intelligence processing power. For the first time since accepting the mission, he began to understand why Evangeline had been able to fly solo reconnaissance missions into the most dangerous airspace on Earth. With neural interface technology, the aircraft became an extension of the pilot's consciousness, and the pilot became something more than human, fast enough, smart enough, and capable enough to survive in environments where conventional human limitations would mean certain death. "Training Phase 1 complete," Harrison announced. "In 8 hours, you'll begin flight simulation training, but first, you need to rest and allow your nervous systems to stabilize after the initial interface experience." As the technicians began disconnecting monitoring equipment, Morrison felt his consciousness contracting back to normal human boundaries. The sensation was disorienting, like suddenly losing senses he'd only just discovered he possessed. "The adjustment period is always difficult," Evangeline said, nodding his expression. "Your brain will spend the next several hours trying to process artificial memories of capabilities you never actually possessed. Try to rest, but don't be surprised if your dreams include flight profiles and sensor data that feel more real than normal experience." Morrison nodded, understanding that he was about to spend the night integrating memories of being something more than human, while his unconscious mind prepared for a mission that would test whether human consciousness could expand enough to prevent the world from destroying itself. Outside the underground facility, the desert night continued its ancient patterns, unaware that buried beneath its surface, two human beings were being transformed into something that had never existed before. Hybrid entities capable of merging with artificial intelligence to become the ultimate weapons in humanity's arsenal. Morrison's dreams were filled with impossible flight, soaring through digital landscapes where altitude was measured in layers of data and navigation, required following streams of pure information through spaces that existed only in the merged consciousness of human minds and artificial intelligence. He woke with memories of flying at speeds that should have killed him, through airspace that defied every principle of aerodynamics he'd learned in 30 years of aviation. The facility's medical staff had warned him about the psychological aftereffects of neural interface training, but experiencing them was unlike anything he could have prepared for. His normal human senses felt inadequate, limited, almost primitive after hours of processing information directly through artificial systems that operated at the speed of thought. Evangeline was waiting in the facility's briefing room when Morrison arrived for the second phase of training, her appearance suggesting she'd had similar experiences during the night. She looked more alert than any human had a right to be after 4 hours of sleep, but her eyes carried the faint disorientation that came from consciousness that had been temporarily expanded beyond normal human boundaries. "How are you feeling?" she asked as Morrison settled into the chair beside her. "Like I spent the night being someone else," Morrison replied honestly. "I keep expecting to see data overlays when I look around the room." "That sensation will fade once we begin active training," Director Harrison said as she entered the briefing room carrying a tablet loaded with information. Morrison, suspected he wouldn't find in any conventional military manual. Today, you'll experience full neural interface while actually flying Seraph 7. Fair warning, the psychological impact of controlling an aircraft through direct consciousness merger is significantly more intense than simulation training. The briefing room's main display activated, showing technical specifications that challenged Morrison's understanding of what aircraft were capable of achieving. Maximum altitude, 150,000 feet. Maximum speed, Mach 8 in atmospheric flight, Mach 12 above 100,000 feet. Range, intercontinental without refueling. Stealth characteristics, virtually undetectable by any known radar or infrared tracking systems. These performance parameters seem impossible, Morrison said, studying numbers that exceeded anything he'd seen in classified briefings on experimental aircraft development. They would be impossible for any aircraft controlled through conventional human interfaces, Harrison agreed. But neural interface technology allows response times and decision-making speeds that make such performance achievable. The aircraft responds to pilot intentions as quickly as the pilot can form them. Evangeline leaned forward, her attention focused on mission-specific details Morrison hadn't seen before. Catherine, the mission profile shows 3 separate destinations with intervals measured in hours, not days. Are we talking about multiple flights? Single flight, Harrison replied. Seraph 7's range and speed capabilities allow delivery of intelligence to London, Tokyo, and Washington within an 8-hour window. Each stop involves landing at facilities similar to this one, transferring data to personnel who operate completely outside normal intelligence channels. Morrison felt his mental image of the mission expanding to encompass something far more complex than he'd initially understood. We're not just delivering intelligence. We're conducting a global operation designed to simultaneously brief decision-makers on 3 continents. That's correct. The intelligence Valkyrie has been gathering indicates coordination between Russian, Chinese, and North Korean military development programs. Preventing the conflict they're planning requires simultaneous action by American, European, and Pacific allies. Morrison studied the flight profile, noting how the timing required precision that allowed no margin for delays, mechanical problems, or unexpected complications. What happens if we encounter resistance? Evangeline's smile carried the dangerous confidence he remembered from their most challenging missions together. Rick, Seraph 7 isn't just a reconnaissance aircraft. The same technology that allows unprecedented stealth and speed also provides offensive capabilities that conventional military forces can't counter. Harrison activated another display, showing weapons systems that Morrison couldn't immediately categorize. Air-to-air missiles with neural guidance systems, directed energy weapons that operate across multiple electromagnetic frequencies, and electronic warfare capabilities that can disable enemy aircraft without physical destruction. Morrison felt his understanding of air combat undergoing another fundamental transformation. You're talking about weapons that respond to pilot thought processes. We're talking about weapons that are pilot thought processes, Evangeline corrected. When you're connected to Seraph 7 through neural interface, every system becomes an extension of your consciousness. Targeting, firing, evasive maneuvering, all of it happens at the speed of thought rather than the speed of mechanical response. Which brings us to the critical point, Harrison said, her expression growing more serious. Tonight's mission will demonstrate capabilities that fundamentally change the nature of modern warfare. After this flight, every military force on Earth will be obsolete except those equipped with similar neural interface technology. Morrison understood the implications. We're not just preventing a war, we're starting an arms race. The arms race started 20 years ago when the first neural interface systems became operational, Harrison replied. Tonight, We're evening the odds by sharing technology that ensures our allies aren't left defenseless against capabilities they don't know exist. The briefing room's intercom crackled with an announcement that flight operations would begin in 30 minutes. Morrison felt his pulse accelerate as the theoretical aspects of neural interface training gave way to the reality of actually flying an aircraft that existed at the intersection of human consciousness and artificial intelligence. "Are there any questions before we proceed to the aircraft?" Harrison asked. Morrison looked at Evangeline, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of anticipation and acceptance he'd seen before their most dangerous missions together. "Eva, what happens if the neural interface fails during flight?" "The aircraft has conventional backup controls, but using them at Seraph 7's operational speeds would be like trying to drive a Formula One race car using smoke signals," she replied. "If the neural interface fails, we die. But Rick, I've been flying neural interface missions for 20 years, and the technology has never failed when it was properly maintained and operated within design parameters." Morrison nodded, understanding that he was about to trust his life not just to technology he barely comprehended, but to his ability to merge his consciousness with artificial systems while maintaining enough individual identity to make decisions that could prevent or trigger global warfare. As they left the briefing room and headed toward the hangar where Seraph 7 waited, Morrison realized that his transformation from conventional military officer to something unprecedented was nearly complete. Within hours, he would either return to Earth as someone who had helped prevent humanity's last war, or he would join Evangeline in the realm where legends went to die quietly, their sacrifices measured only by the disasters that never occurred. The desert sun was setting beyond the facility's concealed entrances, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that filled with the weight of decisions that would ripple across continents and decades. Morrison looked at the woman across from him, scarred, weathered, carrying the accumulated fatigue of 20 years in the shadows, and saw beneath it the same unbreakable spirit that had once made him believe the impossible was merely difficult. "What happens if we do nothing?" Evangeline's smile was sadder than any expression Morrison had ever seen. "Then in 6 months, maybe less, you'll wake up to news reports about a conflict that makes Afghanistan and Iraq look like minor border skirmishes. And the worst part won't be the casualties or the economic devastation or the diplomatic chaos. What will be the worst part? Knowing that we saw it coming and had the intelligence to stop it, but couldn't get that information to the right people, because a pilot who officially died 20 years ago was the only one who knew how to deliver it." Morrison reached for his secure phone, understanding that he was about to make the most important decision of his military career. The woman sitting across from him had sacrificed everything: identity, relationships, the normal human comfort of being known and acknowledged, to keep the world safe from threats most people would never know existed. Now it was his turn to decide how much he was willing to sacrifice to ensure her mission didn't end with both of them buried in unmarked graves, their deaths explained away as classified accidents that never officially happened. The phone rang twice before a voice answered that would change everything. "Joint Chiefs Operations Center, this is Brigadier General Patterson." Morrison looked at Evangeline one more time, seeing in her eyes the same wild confidence that had once made him believe physics was negotiable. "General Patterson, this is Morrison at Ramstein. I need to report a Broken Arrow incident involving classified reconnaissance assets." The code words that would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could control or predict. But as Morrison watched Evangeline's face relax for the first time since she'd entered the room, he knew they were past the point where safe choices existed. Now there was only the mission, and the hope that 20 years of preparation would be enough to prevent the world from learning what war looked like when it was fought by ghosts. The secure line to Washington crackled with encryption static as Brigadier General Patterson's voice took on the sharp edge that indicated full attention. "Morrison, you said Broken Arrow. Confirm that classification." "Confirmed," Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Evangeline's face. "Requesting immediate conference with Joint Chiefs regarding recovered asset with intelligence on enemy hypersonic capabilities and potential compromise of shadow reconnaissance programs." Evangeline nodded approvingly at his careful phrasing. Broken Arrow, the military code for nuclear weapons accidents, would ensure immediate attention from the highest levels of command. But by adding specific details about hypersonic threats and shadow programs, Morrison was sending coded messages that would reach exactly the right ears in the Pentagon's labyrinthine command structure. "Stand by for authentication," Patterson's voice came back. Morrison could hear computer keyboards clicking in the background as his security credentials were verified through multiple databases. The process took 90 seconds, long enough for both officers in Conference Room Alpha to understand they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Authentication confirmed. Morrison, you have priority secure channel to DEFCON Operations Center. Transferring now." The line went silent except for routing tones that seemed to echo through buried cables and satellite relays across half the world. When the connection stabilized, a new voice came on the line, gravelly, tired, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. "Morrison, this is General Hayes, Joint Chiefs. Your message triggered about 6 different alarm systems. What exactly are we looking at?" Morrison glanced at Evangeline, who nodded once. Permission to reveal what could be revealed, careful boundaries around what must remain secret. "General, I have Major Evangeline Thorne in my office. Call sign Valkyrie. She's carrying intelligence on Russian and Chinese weapons development that our current assets haven't detected." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Morrison wondered if the connection had been lost. When Hayes finally spoke, his voice carried a note of impossibility trying to reconcile itself with necessity. "Morrison, Major Thorne's official record shows she died in a training accident 21 years ago. Are you telling me we have a zombie briefing in Conference Room Alpha?" "General, I'm telling you we have a pilot who's been conducting classified reconnaissance missions for the past 20 years and has intelligence that could prevent a global conflict. Her legal status is complicated." Another long pause, then Hayes's voice returned with the particular weariness of someone who had seen too many impossible things become routine realities. "Put her on the line." Evangeline moved to the secure phone with the same precise economy of motion Morrison remembered from their younger days. When she spoke, her voice carried across encrypted circuits with absolute clarity. "General Hayes, this is Valkyrie. Authentication code Sierra Tango 77 Whiskey Romeo." Morrison watched Hayes process this information on the other end of a connection that spanned an ocean and 2 decades of carefully maintained secrets. The authentication code would either confirm Evangeline's identity or trigger security protocols that would end with both of them in military custody. "Jesus Christ," Hayes muttered, apparently to himself. Then more formally, "Valkyrie, your authentication checks out, but according to my briefings, your program was terminated 15 years ago." "My program was never terminated, sir. It was compartmentalized beyond your clearance level. I've been conducting solo reconnaissance missions over Russian nuclear facilities, Chinese military installations, and North Korean submarine bases. Last mission was 48 hours ago over a facility in Siberia that your intelligence reports don't know exists." Morrison felt his understanding of global military dynamics reshaping itself in real time. While he'd been managing routine training flights and diplomatic visits from NATO allies, Evangeline had been flying alone into the most dangerous airspace on Earth, gathering intelligence that apparently never made it into normal military channels. Valkyrie, why are you breaking protocol now? Why surface after 20 years? Evangeline's answer came without hesitation, carrying the weight of someone who had thought through every possible alternative. Because my handlers have gone silent, and the intelligence I'm carrying indicates an imminent threat that our normal military assets aren't equipped to counter. Russian hypersonic glide vehicles, sir. Not the ones your briefings mention, but a new generation with capabilities that make our current missile defense systems obsolete. Morrison could hear papers rustling on Hayes's end of the line, the sound of someone accessing classified databases in real time. What kind of capabilities are we talking about? Mach 15 sustained flight, sir. Maneuverable reentry vehicles that can change course every 30 seconds during their terminal phase. And most importantly, they're being deployed in quantities that suggest the Russians are preparing for a first strike scenario. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of strategic implications that could reshape global military balance. Morrison found himself holding his breath, understanding that the next few minutes of conversation would determine whether Evangeline's 20 years of sacrifice would culminate in preventing a war or dying in a military prison for crimes she couldn't be officially charged with. Valkyrie, Hayes said finally, I need you to understand something. The existence of your program, your missions, your intelligence, none of it can be officially acknowledged. But if what you're saying is accurate, we need that information regardless of where it came from. I understand, sir. I've been operating in legal gray areas for 2 decades. But I need assurance that the intelligence will reach decision makers who can act on it, not disappear into bureaucratic channels where it gets lost or ignored. Morrison watched Evangeline's face as she navigated the conversation, seeing in her expression the hard-won wisdom of someone who understood how power really functioned in the modern world. She wasn't just delivering intelligence. She was orchestrating its delivery to ensure maximum strategic impact. General Hayes, Morrison interjected, with respect, we need to move quickly on this. If Major Thorne's intelligence is accurate, we're looking at a compressed timeline that doesn't allow for normal vetting procedures. Agreed. Morrison, I'm authorizing immediate transport of Valkyrie to Andrews Air Force Base. Full security escort, classified passenger manifest. She briefs the Pentagon intelligence staff in 18 hours. Evangeline shook her head. Sir, I can't travel through normal military channels. Too many people will ask questions that don't have safe answers. And there's something else you need to know. The intelligence I'm carrying can't be transmitted electronically. The Russians have developed quantum computing capabilities that can break any encryption we currently use. Morrison felt another piece of his worldview crumble. Quantum computing was supposed to be decades away from practical military applications, but apparently the future had arrived while he wasn't paying attention. Then how do we get the intelligence to where it needs to go? Hayes asked. Evangeline's smile carried the same dangerous confidence Morrison remembered from their shared past. The same way I've been delivering intelligence for 20 years, General. We use assets that don't officially exist to transport information through channels that can't be monitored or intercepted. You're talking about another flight. I'm talking about the last flight, sir. One final mission to deliver 20 years of accumulated intelligence directly to the people who need it most. But this time, I won't be flying alone. Morrison felt his pulse accelerate as the implications became clear. Eva, you can't be serious. She turned to him with eyes that had looked death in the face so many times that it no longer held any terror for her. Rick, there's something I haven't told you yet. Something that changes everything about why I'm here and what needs to happen next. The secure line carried her words to Washington with perfect digital clarity. But Morrison knew that the truth she was about to reveal would shatter his understanding of not just her mission, but the nature of the threats facing American national security. General Hayes, the Russians didn't just develop hypersonic weapons. They developed the capability to track and target our most classified aircraft. They know about the Shadow reconnaissance programs. They know about Aurora. And most importantly, they know about Wraith. The silence that followed was the sound of strategic assumptions collapsing in real time, replaced by the stark realization that 20 years of technological superiority might have been an illusion all along. "Sir," Evangeline continued, "the reason my handlers went silent is because the enemy isn't just ahead of us technologically. They're inside our decision-making process. And the only way to deliver this intelligence safely is to use the one asset they don't know about yet." "What asset?" Hayes asked, though Morrison suspected they all knew the answer. "Me, General. For 20 years, I've been their most carefully guarded secret. Now I'm going to be their most dangerous weapon." Morrison looked at the woman who had once been his closest friend and realized that her return to Ramstein wasn't the beginning of her story's end. It was the prologue to something that would either save the world or destroy everyone who knew enough to try. The encrypted line to Washington fell silent as the implications of Evangeline's words settled into the minds of men whose careers had been built on managing impossible situations. Morrison watched her face, seeing beneath the weathered features the same calculating intelligence that had once made her the most feared pilot in any squadron she joined. "General Hayes," she continued, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a weather report rather than announcing the potential collapse of American intelligence capabilities. "The facility I photographed in Siberia 48 hours ago wasn't just developing hypersonic weapons. It was testing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Aurora-class reconnaissance aircraft." Morrison felt his breath catch. "You mean they know about the entire program?" "Worse than that, Rick. They've been tracking our flights for at least 18 months. Every mission, every route, every target. They've been letting us collect intelligence while they develop the means to shoot us down whenever they choose to do so." The secure line crackled with what sounded like Hayes consulting with other voices in the background. The whispered conferences that happened when military leaders realized their carefully constructed strategies had been built on compromised foundations. "Valkyrie," Hayes said finally, "if your assessment is correct, we're looking at a fundamental breach of national security. But you said you're carrying intelligence that could prevent a conflict. How do we reconcile that with the possibility that our collection methods have been compromised?" Evangeline leaned back in her chair, and Morrison saw her organizing thoughts that had probably been churning in her mind for months. "Because there's intelligence, and then there's understanding, General. The Russians know about our aircraft, but they don't know about our pilots. They can track our technology, but they can't predict our decision-making processes. And most importantly, they don't know that one of our pilots has been flying solo missions so deep into their territory that she's been collecting intelligence on their counterintelligence operations." Morrison began to understand the elegant complexity of what Evangeline had been doing. "You've been spying on their spying. For the past 3 years, every mission has been a double game. They think they're tracking a reconnaissance aircraft gathering standard intelligence, satellite positions, missile installations, radar capabilities. What they don't realize is that I've been photographing their tracking systems, their communication protocols, their operational security procedures." She reached into her coat and withdrew a second device, this one smaller and more complex looking than the first. Morrison could see indicator lights pulsing in patterns that suggested sophisticated electronics operating far beyond anything he'd encountered in conventional military equipment. "This contains real-time intelligence on how the Russians track our most classified assets. Not just what they know, but how they know it. Which means we can predict their capabilities, counter their countermeasures, and most importantly, identify the sources of their intelligence." Hayes's voice carried a note of hope mixed with professional skepticism. You're saying you've developed a profile of their penetration into our systems. I'm saying I know exactly who's been feeding them information about our operations, General. Names, positions, access levels, communication methods. The breach isn't technological, it's human. And the people responsible are positioned high enough in our intelligence hierarchy to compromise any conventional method of sharing this information. Morrison felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Military betrayal was a possibility every officer lived with, but the idea that 20 years of classified operations had been compromised by human intelligence sources at the highest levels of command was almost too terrible to contemplate. Valkyrie, you understand what you're suggesting. I understand that conventional intelligence channels can't be trusted to deliver this information, which is why I need unconventional methods to get it to people who can act on it without triggering the security protocols that would alert the compromised sources. Morrison watched Evangeline manipulate the conversation with the skill of someone who had spent 20 years navigating the dangerous currents of intelligence operations. She wasn't just delivering information, she was orchestrating its deployment to ensure maximum strategic advantage. General Hayes, Morrison interjected, what kind of resources are we talking about to make this happen? That depends on what Valkyrie needs for her final mission. Evangeline's eyes met Morrison's, and he saw in them the reflection of decisions that would define the rest of both their lives. I need a pilot, Rick. Someone I trust absolutely, who has the skills to handle aircraft that officially don't exist, and who understands that this mission might be classified for the next 50 years. Morrison felt his pulse accelerate as the implications became clear. You want me to fly with you? I want you to fly the mission that ends this, one way or another. The aircraft I've been using for solo reconnaissance can be modified to carry a second pilot. The intelligence I'm carrying needs to be delivered to 3 separate locations simultaneously to ensure it reaches the right people before the compromised sources can interfere. The silence that followed was